Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Sneed, and me and Danny Liebarger are going to present to you the book Just War as Christian Discipleship, Recentering the Tradition in the Church rather than the state. And it's written by Daniel Bell Jr. Really, the premise of the book is looking at just war theory and understanding that for Bell, it is a result of Christian discipleship. He says earlier in the book, he says at the heart of this book is the claim that just war lived out as a form of faithful Christian discipleship may be substantially different from the way just war is understood and used in this public policy approach that is so popular today. Throughout the book, he really analyzes those two forms of just war theory. The first being just war as public policy checklist, the second as just war as Christian discipleship. So public policy checklist really is looking at the criteria of traditional just war theory, and it checks off saying, does this war approach or fit with the criteria of just war theory? If so, then yes, it is a just war that can be waged. But it really, just war as public policy checklist does not really concern itself with the daily life of either nation outside of the war itself. In contrast, just war theory as Christian discipleship really focuses on the person, the day-to-day life and work on behalf of justice and love of neighbor. He says this on page 74. Says the vision focuses on how just war is an expression of the character of the Christian community, an outgrowth of its fundamental confessions, convictions, and practices, and an extension of its consistent day-to-day life and work on behalf of justice and love of neighbor in the time and realm of war. Again, just war for Bell is a result or an extension of our faithful discipleship in Jesus Christ. So he begins the book by looking in the first three chapters at a brief history of the just war tradition. It's important to note that Bell makes the distinction that just war tradition did not start with Christianity, but rather Christianity adopted it from ancient Greek and Roman cultures and then developed it further. He cites two influential voices in the Christian tradition that really pushed this to the forefront. The first is Ambrose, a 4th century bishop, and St. Augustine. And those two are really kind of the ones that brought about this theory into the Christian realm. Augustine is really known as kind of the father of just war tradition in Christianity. He cites often that the reason that people of God are not to kill is not because life is sacred, but because we do not have the authority to kill. However, on occasions, Augustine wrote that there are times when God will share his authority with humans for that. Augustine wrote, as to killing others in order to defend one's own life, I do not approve of this. Unless one happens to be a soldier or public functionary acting not for himself, but in defense of others, or of the city in which he resides, if he acts according to the commission lawfully given him, and in the manner becoming his office. So for Augustine, the legitimate cause of just war is not rooted in self-defense, which we'll get into in a bit. So chapters 4 through 8 then really focus on the 7 criteria that Bell asserts are necessary for the just war as Christian discipleship tradition. Those are, number 1, legitimate authority. Number 2, just cause. Number 3, right intent. Number 4, last resort. 5, reasonable chance of success. 6, discrimination. And 7, proportionality. It's important to note before we get into these two that these do not work exclusive of one another. But instead, Bell asserts that all of these criteria function as a whole. That a just war as Christian discipleship is not concerned in checking the list off, but rather that these criteria are embodied by the community of believers for the common good, for the ultimate justice and peace of humanity, if you will. So, the criteria number 1, legitimate authority. This criterion really seeks to answer the question, really 2 questions. One is, who may wage war? And second, who determines if waging war in a particular situation is just? For public policy checklists, it resides really in the natural law of self-preservation. Again, as mentioned before, self-defense is the primary authority for just war as public policy checklist. In contrast, for public policy as for just war as Christian discipleship, the authority resides in its theological foundation. That God alone has final authority over life and death. Page 125, Bell says, to put this in its simplest terms, in just war Christian discipleship, legitimate authority arises out of and is irreducibly tied to a vision of God's political hopes and providential care for humanity. That God has the authority over life, over death, over war. And so that is whoever God decides is who may wage war. And that second question, who determines if waging a war in a particular situation is just? Public policy checklist grants the state authority to decide the appropriateness of war. For just war as Christian discipleship, it grants the power to the state or the heads of state and the authority based on the moral and theological vision that I mentioned above. Just war as Christian discipleship envisions two other authorities that I won't have time to get into, but he looks at the individual as well as the church as having some authority over whether you support or not support a war is just or unjust. Criteria number 2, just cause. This criteria really seeks to answer the question of why one wages war. Public policy checklist centers again around self-defense. And really the differences here between public policy checklist and Christian discipleship are pretty substantial. And so for Christian discipleship, it is fundamentally other-oriented, even to the extent, as Augustine wrote above, that self-defense alone is not a legitimate cause for just war. From the Christian discipleship standpoint, it is important to consider the nature of justice. Bell asserts that justice can mean many different things to many different people. He talks about how really that justice often rests on the belief that not the individual, but instead the justice for everyone is what is important. Distinction is important because if the individual is elevated, then the goal of justice is often to avoid conflict or to live and let live. But if justice is primarily other-centered, then just war as Christian discipleship is working towards fostering human communion. It is about working toward the common goal of both enemy and ourselves, and that is a very, very daunting task to consider. But again, just war, or what is a just cause then for war for Christian discipleship? And again, it's rooted in the common good and justice for others. Therefore, it's focused not in self-defense, but in the defense of others, especially the marginalized and the innocent. In short, and this is where Bell, he also talks about preemptive and preventative efforts for causing or waging war. And really cites two things, that if you're going to preemptively wage war or preventatively wage war, that there are two criteria that fall under that, and it must be, there is a place for that, but the threat must qualify as both an imminent danger and a grave and unjustly danger. So moving on to the criteria number 3, right intent. This seeks to answer the question of why do we fight? And for public policy checklist, it really doesn't place a high significance on intent and sees it more of a formality. Bell writes on page 158, when just war as Christian discipleship identifies right intent with peace, it follows Augustine and further specifies that the peace rightly intended in a just war is a just peace. It is not merely for the peace of the strong who are able to impose their will on others, nor is it the unreflective peace of the public policy checklist that is at best a mere formality. Instead, it is the peace that is the fruit of solidarity in the common good. Again, everything is rooted in the common good. So moving on to criteria 4 and 5, which I'll do together and move quickly through them, is number 4 is last resort. Number 5 is reasonable chance of success. For Bell, he says that the last resort reminds us that just cause alone is necessary but not sufficient in itself as an element for just war. But rather that as a war must be waged, that every other avenue must be approached to resolve the conflict before choosing war. And then lastly, that you must look at it as a reasonable chance of success, that as you begin to wage this war, you recognize that this is a winnable cause, a winnable war, and then you may engage in that. Which really leads to our last two criteria, which is discrimination and proportionality. And discrimination really looks at the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, recognizing that not all in a country are involved in war. And so you must distinguish that. The second, or the last one, again, proportionality, is that really looking at the economy of force that's to be used in war. It says that the maximum amount of force allotted to be used or allowed to be used is really the least amount that's able to be to win the war, that's needed to win the war. So all in all, Bell's book, I thought it was a tremendous look at the just war theory as Christian discipleship. And I want to close with just this final quote. He says, whether or not living the discipline would increase or decrease the number of wars in which Christians were engaged is something I doubt can be determined in the abstract. What is indisputably true is that just war as Christian discipleship calls us out of self-absorption, apathy, fear, and indifference in order to risk much, indeed everything, in the service of others for the sake